I was just a quiet passenger in seat 14A. Nobody knew my past. Then both pilots collapsed at 39,000 feet. 200 people started screaming. That's when the F-22 fighter jets arrived. And when they whispered my old military call sign over the radio, I knew my secret was over. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 777 pushed back from Gate 23 at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon, carrying 283 passengers who had no idea that the woman in seat 14A would soon become the only thing standing between them and certain death. She looked completely ordinary as she settled into her window seat, wearing comfortable jeans and a plain navy blue sweater that could have come from any department store in America. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup except for a touch of lip gloss. The small carry-on bag she tucked under the seat in front of her contained nothing more interesting than a paperback novel, a bottle of water, and some headphones. Everything about her appearance suggested she was just another passenger on just another flight, and that was exactly how she wanted it. The flight attendant working the economy cabin, a cheerful woman named Rebecca, stopped at row 14 with her standard beverage cart. "Can I get you something to drink before we take off?" she asked with the practiced smile of someone who had asked this question 10,000 times. The woman in 14A looked up from her book and smiled back. "Just water, please," she said in a soft voice that carried no hint of command or authority. Rebecca handed her a plastic cup of ice water and moved on without a second glance, treating her exactly the same as every other passenger in the cabin. There was nothing about this woman that suggested she needed special attention or possessed any unique qualifications. She was just another face in a sea of travelers, completely unremarkable and easily forgotten. The man in seat 14B, a chatty sales representative named Marcus, settled in beside her as the plane began its taxi toward the runway. "First time to Chicago?" he asked, apparently eager for conversation during the 5-hour flight ahead. The woman in 14A shook her head politely. "No, I've been a few times," she said. "Business or pleasure?" Marcus continued. She paused for just a moment before answering. "Just visiting family," she said quietly. "Nothing exciting. I'm just a passenger heading east like everyone else." Her tone was gentle and humble, giving absolutely no indication that she had spent the last 15 years as one of the most accomplished fighter pilots in United States Air Force history, that she had flown more combat missions than almost any other pilot in her generation, or that her call sign was spoken with reverence in ready rooms across the world. Marcus nodded and launched into a detailed explanation of his medical device sales territory while the woman in 14A listened politely, occasionally nodding but saying very little about herself. She had become extremely skilled at deflecting personal questions over the years, always steering conversations away from her background and toward other topics. When Marcus asked what she did for work, she simply said she had recently changed jobs and was taking some time off before starting something new. This answer was technically true since she had just completed her terminal leave from the Air Force after 20 years of service, but it revealed nothing about the distinguished flying crosses in her personnel file, the enemy aircraft she had shot down over hostile territory, or the impossible rescue mission that had earned her the Air Force Cross and made her a legend among combat aviators. The young woman in seat 14C, a college student named Emma, leaned over during the safety demonstration. "I hate flying," she whispered nervously. "Every little bump freaks me out." The woman in 14A turned and gave her a reassuring smile. "Flying is actually incredibly safe," she said gently. "These planes are amazing machines, and the pilots flying them are highly trained professionals. You're safer up here than you would be driving on the highway." Her voice carried such calm certainty that Emma visibly relaxed. What Emma could not possibly know was that the woman offering this reassurance had herself flown fighter jets through surface-to-air missile fire, had landed damaged aircraft on pitching carrier decks in storms, and possessed such extraordinary aviation skills that she had once been personally recruited to test experimental aircraft that only the best of the best were allowed to touch. As Flight 2847 climbed through 15,000 feet on its way to cruising altitude, the woman in 14A gazed out the window at the cloud formations below, her trained eye automatically noting wind patterns and weather conditions in a way that had become second nature after thousands of hours in the air. She had deliberately chosen a window seat because she loved watching the Earth fall away during takeoff, loved the moment when the wheels left the ground and the aircraft transitioned from a machine bound to the Earth into something graceful and free. Flying had been her entire life for 2 decades, but now she was trying to figure out what came next. The Air Force had offered her a promotion to full colonel and a Pentagon assignment, but she had declined, feeling that it was time for something different. She had no clear plan yet, which was why she was traveling as just a passenger for the first time in years, heading to Chicago to visit her sister and try to figure out what a fighter pilot did when she stopped being a fighter pilot. The flight leveled off at 39,000 feet, and the captain made his announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude and the flight attendants will begin beverage service shortly. We're expecting smooth air most of the way to Chicago with an on-time arrival. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." His voice was confident and professional, exactly what passengers wanted to hear. In the cockpit, Captain James Morrison and First Officer David Chen had just finished their post-climb checklist and settled in for what they expected to be a routine flight. Both men were experienced aviators with clean safety records and thousands of hours in the Boeing 777. Neither of them had any idea that they were about to become the center of a catastrophic medical emergency that would leave their aircraft without a conscious crew while flying over the Rocky Mountains at nearly 600 miles per hour. Rebecca came through the cabin with her beverage cart, and the woman in 14A accepted another cup of water while Marcus ordered a gin and tonic and Emma got a Diet Coke. The cabin had settled into the familiar rhythm of a long flight, with some passengers reading, others watching movies on their seatback screens, and many simply dozing in their seats. The woman in 14A returned to her novel, a thriller about international espionage that she found mildly entertaining despite its technical inaccuracies about aircraft and flying. She had learned long ago not to point out such mistakes in books and movies because doing so inevitably led to questions about how she knew so much about aviation, which led to questions about her background, which led to conversations she preferred to avoid. 90 minutes into the flight, something went catastrophically wrong. In the cockpit, Captain Morrison suddenly felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, followed immediately by severe nausea and abdominal cramping. He looked over at First Officer Chen to say something, but the words died in his throat as he saw that Chen had gone pale and was gripping the armrests of his seat with white knuckles. "Dave?" Morrison managed to say, but his first officer did not respond. Chen's eyes rolled back in his head and he slumped forward in his harness, unconscious. Morrison tried to reach for the radio to declare an emergency, but his own vision was tunneling rapidly and his limbs felt like they were made of lead. His last conscious thought was that something in the crew meal must have been contaminated, and then he too collapsed forward in his seat, leaving the Boeing 777 flying on autopilot with no conscious crew and 283 passengers who had no idea their pilots were incapacitated. The senior flight attendant, a 30-year veteran named Patricia, noticed something was wrong when she tried to contact the cockpit on the intercom to ask about beginning the meal service and got no response. She tried twice more, increasingly concerned, before walking forward to the cockpit door and knocking. "Captain Morrison," she called. No answer. She knocked harder. Still nothing. Patricia felt her heart rate accelerate as she entered the security code and opened the cockpit door, following the protocols for checking on the flight crew. What she saw made her blood run cold. Both pilots were slumped unconscious in their seats, and the aircraft was flying itself with no human hand on the controls. Patricia's training kicked in immediately despite her terror. She pressed the call button for Rebecca and another flight attendant named Michael, keeping her voice as calm as possible when they arrived at the cockpit door. "Both pilots are unconscious," she said quietly, not wanting to alarm the passengers. "We need to follow the emergency protocol immediately. Michael, check if there are any qualified pilots among the passengers. Rebecca, prepare the cabin for a possible emergency landing. Do not tell the passengers what's happened yet, but I need you to be ready." Michael nodded, his face pale, and turned toward the cabin. Rebecca gripped Patricia's arm. "What if there's no one who can fly this plane?" she whispered. Patricia's jaw tightened. "Then we're going to die," she said flatly. "So you better pray there's someone on this aircraft who knows how to land a Boeing 777. Michael picked up the intercom microphone with shaking hands and made an announcement that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a medical emergency. If there is anyone on board with flight experience, particularly with commercial aircraft, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately. This is an urgent request." The cabin erupted in confused murmurs as passengers looked at each other with growing alarm. The tone of the announcement had been deliberately vague, but people were not stupid. They could hear the barely controlled fear in Michael's voice, and they understood that something was very wrong. In seat 14A, the woman who had been reading her novel closed the book slowly and stood up. Her entire demeanor had changed in an instant. The humble, soft-spoken passenger who had described herself as just a passenger was gone, replaced by something else entirely. Her eyes had sharpened, her posture had straightened, and there was suddenly an unmistakable aura of command radiating from her that made nearby passengers instinctively lean away. She moved into the aisle and raised her hand, her voice clear and authoritative as she called out to Michael. "I have flight experience," she said. For simple words, delivered with such absolute confidence that every head in the cabin turned to look at her. Michael practically ran down the aisle to her. "What kind of experience?" he asked urgently. She looked him directly in the eye. 20 years military aviation," she said crisply. "Fighter jets, combat operations, test pilot school. I've flown everything from trainers to fifth-generation fighters. I can fly this aircraft." Michael's eyes widened. "Follow me," he said immediately, and she moved forward through the cabin with purposeful strides while passengers watched in stunned silence. Emma, the nervous college student in 14C, stared at the woman who had been sitting beside her in disbelief. "She said she was just a passenger," Emma whispered to Marcus. Marcus could only shake his head, equally shocked by the transformation they had just witnessed. Patricia met her at the cockpit door, quickly briefing her on what she had found. The woman nodded, her face grim, and stepped into the cockpit. She took in the scene with a single sweeping glance, her trained eye immediately assessing the situation. Both pilots were definitely unconscious but breathing, which meant they were likely suffering from food poisoning or some other toxin rather than heart attacks. The autopilot was engaged and holding the aircraft steady at 39,000 feet, but that would not help them land. The GPS showed they were over the Rocky Mountains, approximately 200 miles from Denver, with Chicago still more than 800 miles ahead. She had to make a decision immediately. She slid into the captain's seat after Patricia and Michael pulled the unconscious Morrison out and laid him on the cockpit floor. Her hands moved over the controls with practiced familiarity, even though she had never actually flown a Boeing 777 before. Commercial aircraft use different systems than military fighters, but the fundamental principles of flight were the same, and she had enough cross-training to understand what she was looking at. The aircraft was flying itself competently for now, but autopilot could not land the plane. She would have to do that manually, and she would only get one chance. She reached for the radio and changed the frequency to the emergency channel. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," she transmitted, her voice steady and professional. "This is United Flight 2847, heavy Boeing 777 en route from Seattle to Chicago. Both pilots are incapacitated due to suspected food poisoning. I am a passenger with military flight experience who has assumed control of the aircraft. Requesting immediate assistance and vectors to the nearest suitable airport for emergency landing." Her transmission was textbook perfect, delivering critical information in the minimum number of words with zero panic in her voice. The response came back within seconds from Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center. "United 2847, Denver Center, we copy your emergency. Confirm both pilots are incapacitated and you are a passenger now flying the aircraft?" The controller's voice betrayed his shock despite his training. "Affirmative, Denver," she replied calmly. I am a former military aviator with 20 years experience. I have never flown this specific aircraft type, but I am familiar with commercial aviation systems. I need you to vector me to the nearest airport with emergency equipment and talk me through the approach and landing procedures for this aircraft. The Denver Center controller, a 28-year veteran named Robert Garrison, felt his mouth go dry. In nearly 3 decades of controlling air traffic, he had never encountered anything like this. He keyed his microphone, forcing his voice to remain professional. United 2847, understand you are a military pilot. Can you provide more details on your background? She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before responding. I flew F-22 Raptors for the United States Air Force, she said. Among other aircraft. I am instrument rated and have logged over 4,000 flight hours. I can do this, Denver, but I need your help. Robert Garrison sat up straighter in his chair. Someone who flew F-22s was not just any pilot. The F-22 Raptor was the most advanced and difficult fighter jet in the world, and the Air Force only put their absolute best aviators in those cockpits. If this woman had flown Raptors, she had skills that most commercial pilots could only dream of. United 2847, we are going to get you down safely, he said with renewed confidence. Stand by while I coordinate with Boeing and get you a technical advisor on the line. In the meantime, I am vectoring you toward Denver International. Weather is clear, winds are light, and we are clearing all other traffic out of your way. She acknowledged and allowed herself a small breath of relief. Denver was good. Long runways, excellent emergency services, and relatively easy terrain on approach. She could do this. She began scanning the instrument panel more carefully, identifying each system and control. The Boeing 777 was a marvel of modern aviation technology, with sophisticated computers handling most of the flying, but it was also designed to be flown manually by skilled pilots when necessary. She would need to disconnect the autopilot for landing and hand-fly the aircraft to the runway, something she had done thousands of times in fighters but never in a massive commercial aircraft weighing over 600,000 pounds. While she was studying the controls, something else was happening in the background that she did not yet know about. When Robert Garrison reported to his supervisor that a military F-22 pilot was attempting to land a commercial airliner, the FAA immediately contacted the United States Air Force to verify her credentials and see if they could provide additional assistance. The Air Force, in turn, scrambled 2 F-22 Raptors from Buckley Space Force Base in Aurora, Colorado, to intercept and visually assess the situation. This was standard protocol when a commercial aircraft declared an emergency over the continental United States, but what happened next was anything but standard. The 2 F-22 pilots, Major Tyler Snake Harrison and Captain Jennifer Phoenix Rodriguez, were airborne within minutes and climbing rapidly toward the altitude where United Flight 2847 was flying. They established contact with Denver Center and requested the tail number and all available information about the emergency. When they received the briefing that both commercial pilots were unconscious and a passenger with military aviation experience had taken control, Phoenix keyed her radio to her wingman on their discrete tactical frequency. "Snake, you hearing this?" she asked. "Former Air Force, flew F-22s, over 4,000 hours. There aren't that many female Raptor pilots. You thinking what I'm thinking?" Snake checked his notes from the briefing. Denver Center said the passenger didn't give a name yet, just credentials. "But yeah, if she flew Raptors and has that many hours, there's only a handful of people it could be." He paused. "Phoenix, you don't think it's..." He could not even finish the sentence. Phoenix felt goosebumps rise on her arms despite the climate-controlled cockpit. "If it is, we're about to witness a legend pull off the impossible." Again. As the 2 F-22s approached the Boeing 777, Denver Center contacted them with an update. "Raptor flight, Denver Center. United 2847 has provided additional information. The pilot in command is Colonel Sarah Chen, United States Air Force, retired. She separated from service 2 months ago. Does that name mean anything to you?" There was a long silence on the frequency. Finally, Snake's voice came back, and it was barely above a whisper. Denver Center, Raptor 1-1. Confirm you said Sarah Chen. The controller checked his notes. Affirmative. Colonel Sarah Chen. Do you know her? Inside his F-22, Major Tyler Harrison felt like he had been punched in the chest. Every fighter pilot in the United States Air Force knew that name. Every fighter pilot in the world knew that name. Sarah Valkyrie Chen was not just a legendary aviator. She was the standard by which all other fighter pilots measured themselves, a warrior whose achievements read like fiction rather than fact. She had shot down 7 enemy fighters during combat operations in Syria, making her the first American female ace in history. She had commanded the most elite fighter squadron in the Air Force and had personally trained 3 generations of Raptor pilots. She had test-flown experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible. Her call sign, Valkyrie, had been given to her after a mission where she had single-handedly held off an entire enemy fighter wing to protect a downed rescue helicopter, an action so impossibly brave that grown men wept when they heard the radio recordings. Phoenix's voice came over the radio, and she too was whispering. It's Valkyrie, she said, as if speaking the call sign too loudly would somehow break the reverence of the moment. The Valkyrie is flying that 777. Snake took a breath. Denver Center, Raptor 1-1. We know Colonel Chen. Or rather, we know of her. She was, the best fighter pilot in the Air Force. If anyone can land that aircraft safely, it's her. But we request permission to escort her all the way in and provide any assistance we can. It would be an honor. The controller relayed this information to his supervisor, who immediately approved the request. On board United Flight 2847, Sarah Chen heard Denver Center come back on the radio. United 2847, Denver Center. We have 2 F-22 Raptors approaching your position to provide escort and assistance. They will be flying visual formation with you and can relay information. The pilot specifically requested this assignment when they learned who you are. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly. So they knew. She had hoped to remain anonymous, to just land this plane and disappear back into civilian life without fanfare. But the Air Force community was small, especially among Raptor pilots, and apparently word had already spread about who was flying the crippled commercial aircraft. Moments later, she saw the 2 F-22s pull into formation on either side of the Boeing 777, their sleek angular shapes unmistakable against the blue sky. They were beautiful aircraft, and seeing them brought a flood of memories and emotions that she pushed firmly aside. She had work to do, and nostalgia was a luxury she could not afford right now. She keyed the radio. Raptor Flight, United 2847. I have you visual. Appreciate the escort. There was a pause, and then Snake's voice came back, and there was something in his tone that made Sarah's breath catch. Ma'am, he said, and his voice carried a weight of respect and awe that was unmistakable even over the radio. It's an honor to fly with you. We've got your 6. Phoenix added her own transmission, and her voice was equally reverent. Valkyrie, she said, using Sarah's call sign for the first time. The whole Air Force is watching. You've got this. We believe in you. Sarah felt unexpected tears prick at her eyes, which she blinked away quickly. She had not realized how much she missed this, missed being part of something bigger than herself, missed the brotherhood and sisterhood of military aviation where pilots looked out for each other and would fly into hell itself to bring a comrade home. Thank you, Raptor Flight, she said quietly. Let's get these people on the ground safely. Back at Denver Center, Robert Garrison was now working with a Boeing technical representative named Amanda Wells who had been patched in via phone to talk Sarah through the specific systems of the 777. Amanda had spent 20 years as an airline pilot before retiring to work for Boeing, and she knew the aircraft inside and out. Colonel Chen, Amanda said, her own voice betraying her excitement at who she was talking to. I'm going to walk you through every step of this. The 777 is designed to be user-friendly, and with your background, you should have no trouble. The biggest difference from what you're used to is the weight and the fact that commercial aircraft don't respond as quickly to control inputs. Everything is going to feel slower and heavier than a fighter, but the principles are the same. Sarah acknowledged and began working through the checklist that Amanda provided. She had to configure the aircraft for descent and approach, which meant setting up the flight management computer, extending flaps and landing gear at the appropriate times, and managing the speed carefully to avoid either stalling the aircraft or coming in too fast to stop on the runway. With Amanda's guidance and her own extensive aviation knowledge, she began to feel more confident. This was just flying, and flying was something she knew how to do better than almost anyone alive. In the cabin, Patricia had made an announcement explaining that there was a medical emergency with the flight crew and that a qualified pilot had taken control of the aircraft. She deliberately did not mention that this qualified pilot was a passenger, not wanting to cause panic, but passengers were intelligent enough to put the pieces together. The cabin was eerily quiet, with people gripping armrests and some crying softly. Emma, the college student, was praying under her breath while Marcus sat beside her looking pale and shaken. Everyone understood that their lives now depended entirely on the woman who had been sitting anonymously in seat 14A just 2 hours earlier. Sarah began her descent toward Denver, following the vectors that air traffic control provided. The F-22s remained in formation with her, and their presence was both comforting and surreal. She had flown countless missions in Raptors, had pushed those magnificent machines to their absolute limits, but she had never imagined she would one day be flying a commercial airliner with Raptors as her escort. Denver Center cleared all other aircraft from the airspace, giving her a direct path to the airport. Fire trucks and ambulances were already positioning themselves along the runway, prepared for the worst but hoping for the best. As she descended through 20,000 feet, Amanda walked her through the approach configuration. "You're going to extend your flaps in stages," Amanda explained. "Each notch of flaps gives you more lift but also more drag, so you'll need to adjust your throttle to maintain your target speed. I'll call out each configuration change and what speed you should be holding." Sarah's hands moved over the controls with precision, and she felt the massive aircraft respond to her inputs. The Boeing 777 was indeed much heavier and slower to respond than her beloved F-22, but it was also stable and predictable. She could work with this. Snake and Phoenix monitored her descent, providing running commentary that she could hear both planes were transmitting on a frequency that had somehow become open to dozens of other military aircraft in the region. Fighter pilots from multiple bases had tuned in, wanting to hear Valkyrie's voice one more time, wanting to witness this impossible situation. The radio discipline was perfect, with no one interfering, but Sarah could sense the silent crowd listening to every transmission. The weight of expectation was enormous, but she had learned long ago to shut out external pressure and focus only on the task at hand. At 10,000 feet, Denver Center gave her the final approach clearance. "United 2847, you are cleared for the ILS approach to runway 34 right. Wind is 350 at 8 knots, altimeter 3012. Emergency equipment is standing by." Sarah acknowledged and lined up on the localizer, the electronic beam that would guide her to the runway. Her hands were steady on the controls, her breathing calm and measured. She had done this 1,000 times before in simulators and in actual aircraft. The only difference was that this time, 283 people who were not trained for this situation were depending on her, and there would be no second chances. Amanda continued her steady guidance. "You're right on the glide slope, Colonel. Speed is good. Start reducing to your final approach speed of 145 knots. At 500 feet you'll see the runway, and that's when you'll transition to visual flight and hand fly it the rest of the way in." Sarah made the tiny corrections needed to stay on the electronic path, feeling the aircraft respond to her touch. She was in the zone now, that perfect state of focus where time seemed to slow down and every movement was instinctive and correct. This was what she had been born to do. At 1,000 feet, she could see Denver International Airport spread out before her, the parallel runway stretching into the distance. Emergency vehicles lined both sides of runway 34 right, their lights flashing in the late afternoon sun. She caught a glimpse of news helicopters circling at a safe distance. Apparently someone had leaked the story and the media was already covering what they were calling a miracle in progress. She blocked it all out and focused only on the runway's centerline, on keeping her speed and descent rate exactly where they needed to be. Phoenix's voice came over the radio one more time. "Valkyrie, you are looking perfect. 500 feet, runway is made. Bring her home." Sarah disconnected the autopilot and took manual control, her hands firm on the yoke. The massive aircraft responded to her inputs, and she made the final corrections to align with the centerline. The runway rushed up to meet her, and she pulled back slightly on the throttles, letting the aircraft settle. At 50 feet, she began the flare, pulling the nose up gently to reduce the descent rate. At 30 feet, she continued the flare, feeling for the exact moment when the main wheels would kiss the runway. The Boeing 777 touched down so smoothly that passengers in the cabin barely felt it, the main gear making contact with the concrete as gently as a commercial pilot with 30 years of experience could have done. Sarah immediately deployed the thrust reversers and applied the brakes, feeling the enormous aircraft slow from 145 knots. The runway was more than 12,000 feet long, and she used less than half of it before bringing the 777 to a complete stop. She sat for a moment in the sudden silence, her hands still on the controls, processing what had just happened. She had done it. Everyone was safe. The radio erupted with transmissions. Denver Tower was congratulating her, Amanda from Boeing was crying with relief, and Robert Garrison was calling her the finest pilot he had ever worked with in 30 years of air traffic control. But it was Snake and Phoenix's transmissions that made Sarah's eyes fill with tears. "Valkyrie, Raptor 11, Snake said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "That was the most beautiful landing I have ever witnessed. You just saved 283 lives with skill that defies description. It has been the greatest honor of my career to fly with you today." Phoenix added her own words. "Ma'am, we're going to tell our grandchildren about this. About the day we escorted the legendary Valkyrie to the most important landing of her career. You are everything they say you are and more. The Air Force misses you, but those passengers will be grateful to you for the rest of their lives." Sarah keyed her microphone one final time to respond to her escorts. "Thank you, Raptor Flight," she said softly. "For everything. You too fly safe. And take care of that beautiful bird. She's something special." As emergency crews surrounded the aircraft and paramedics boarded to treat the unconscious pilots, Sarah stood up from the captain's seat and walked back into the cabin. Passengers stared at her in awe and disbelief, many of them openly weeping with relief. Emma, the nervous college student, was one of the first to find her voice. "You saved us," she said, her voice shaking. "You said you were just a passenger, but you saved all our lives." Sarah shook her head gently. "I am just a passenger," she said. "I just happen to know how to fly. Any pilot would have done the same thing." But that was not true, and everyone knew it. Not just any pilot could have done what she had just done. It took someone with extraordinary skill, ice-cold nerves, and the kind of experience that only came from years of facing death in combat and emerging victorious every time. It took someone whose call sign was whispered with reverence by the best fighter pilots in the world. It took Valkyrie. Patricia approached her with tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to thank you," the senior flight attendant said. "You gave all of us our lives back. You gave us back our futures, our families, everything." Sarah reached out and squeezed Patricia's hand. "You kept everyone calm and helped me focus on flying," she said. "We did this together. I couldn't have done it without your crew's support." As passengers began deplaning down the emergency stairs, many of them stopped to hug Sarah or shake her hand or simply look at her with grateful, tear-filled eyes. Marcus, the talkative sales representative, approached her with a look of wonder on his face. "I sat next to you for 2 hours," he said in disbelief. I asked you what you did for a living and you said you were between jobs. You're a hero. You're a legend. And I had no idea. Sarah smiled at him tiredly. I really am between jobs, she said. And I really was just a passenger in seat 14A. I just got unexpectedly recruited to fly when the pilots couldn't. Within hours, the story had spread across the world. News outlets were calling it the miracle on runway 34, and Sarah's name and military record were being broadcast everywhere despite her wishes for privacy. Video footage of the landing, shot from news helicopters, showed the Boeing 777 touching down perfectly while two F-22 Raptors flew overhead in a salute. The image became iconic instantly, symbolizing the extraordinary skill of military aviators and the randomness of fate that had placed someone with Sarah's capabilities on that specific flight at that specific time. The two unconscious pilots recovered fully in the hospital, where tests confirmed they had indeed suffered from severe food poisoning caused by contaminated fish in the crew meal. They both sought out Sarah to thank her personally for saving not just the passengers and crew but also their own lives and reputations. Captain Morrison shook her hand with tears in his eyes. You did something I'm not sure any commercial pilot could have done, he said. Landing an aircraft you've never flown before, with no training on that type, while 283 people are depending on you. That takes a level of skill I can't even comprehend. The FAA launched an investigation into the incident but concluded within days that Sarah had performed flawlessly and followed all appropriate procedures. Boeing invited her to their headquarters to thank her personally and offered her a position as a test pilot and consultant, which she politely declined. The Air Force reached out through back channels to ask if she would consider coming back, suggesting that legends like her were always welcome home. She declined that as well, explaining that she had made her peace with leaving and wanted to find a new path forward. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after the incident, Sarah received a package at her sister's house in Chicago where she was still staying. Inside was a flight suit patch, custom-made, showing a Valkyrie flying over a Boeing 777 with two F-22 Raptors in formation. Attached was a note signed by Major Tyler Snake Harrison, Captain Jennifer Phoenix Rodriguez, and 47 other F-22 pilots from bases across the United States. The note read, "To Colonel Sarah Valkyrie Chen, who showed the world what we already knew, that you are the finest pilot of our generation. Your legend continues. Your call sign will be whispered forever. Fair winds and following seas." Sarah sat in her sister's living room holding the patch and crying quietly, something she had not allowed herself to do since the day of the emergency landing. She had spent 20 years proving herself, fighting battles both in the air and on the ground, earning respect through excellence that could not be denied. She had been the first woman to do many things, and she had done them all so well that her gender became irrelevant in the face of her achievements. She had earned a call sign that represented everything she valued: strength, honor, protection, and the warrior spirit that chose death over dishonor. And now, in what was supposed to be her transition to civilian life, she had one more time proven that Valkyrie was not just a call sign. It was who she was at her core. A protector. A warrior, someone who flew into danger to bring others home safely. The passengers of United Flight 2847 would never forget the woman in seat 14A who saved their lives. The two F-22 pilots who escorted her that day would tell the story of flying with Valkyrie for the rest of their careers. And somewhere in Air Force ready rooms around the world, young pilots would hear about the emergency landing and would whisper the call sign with reverence, knowing that legends were not born but forged through actions that defined the impossible as merely difficult. Sarah eventually accepted a position at a major aviation university, teaching the next generation of pilots and sharing the knowledge she had accumulated over thousands of hours in the sky. She never sought recognition or attention for what happened that day over Denver, always deflecting praise and insisting she had simply done what any qualified pilot would do. But those who knew better, those who understood the extraordinary nature of her achievement, ensured that the story was preserved and told accurately. Years later, the passengers of United Flight 2847 held an annual reunion on the anniversary of the emergency landing. They invited Sarah every year, and she attended when she could, always uncomfortable with being the center of attention but understanding that these people needed to express their gratitude. They had formed a bond through shared trauma and miraculous survival, and Sarah had become part of that family whether she wanted to be or not. Emma, the nervous college student who had sat in 14C, became a pilot herself, inspired by the woman who had saved her life. She earned her commercial rating and eventually flew for a major airline, always telling her passengers during introductory announcements that she became a pilot because she once saw someone do the impossible and wanted to live up to that standard. Marcus, the sales representative, quit his job and became an advocate for aviation safety, pushing for better protocols to prevent dual-pilot incapacitation and working to ensure that commercial aircraft had better backup systems. The Boeing 777 that Sarah landed that day was repaired, inspected, and returned to service. The airline discreetly installed a small plaque in the cockpit that read, "Successfully emergency landed by Colonel Sarah Valkyrie Chen, USAF, Ret. November 2024. All 283 souls on board survived." Pilots who flew that particular aircraft considered it good luck and an honor to sit in the seat where a legend had once worked a miracle. And in F-22 squadrons around the world, when new pilots arrived for their first day, the old hands would take them aside during a quiet moment and tell them a story. They would tell them about the day that Valkyrie, the greatest fighter pilot of their generation, proved one final time why her call sign was spoken in whispers of reverence. They would tell them about 283 people who went to sleep in their own beds that night instead of dying in a mountain crash because a woman in seat 14A turned out to be anything but just a passenger. They would tell them that this was what it meant to be a military aviator. To be ready when called, even in retirement, even when sitting in economy class on a commercial flight, even when the situation seemed hopeless. To have skills so ingrained that they became instinct, so refined that the impossible became routine. To live by a code that said you protected those who could not protect themselves, no matter the cost, no matter the risk, no matter the circumstances. And they would tell them that somewhere out there, there was a woman who had once worn the wings and the uniform and the call sign of Valkyrie, who had flown the most advanced fighter jets ever built into combat and emerged victorious, who had commanded squadrons and trained generations of pilots, who had tested experimental aircraft at the edge of what was possible. A woman who had given 20 years to the service of her country and then walked away quietly when her time was done, seeking no glory, expecting no recognition, simply moving on to whatever came next. A woman who had been sitting in seat 14A, reading a paperback novel and describing herself as just a passenger, right up until the moment when she wasn't. Right up until the moment when destiny called one more time and she answered as she always had, with skill and courage and the quiet certainty that she would do whatever was necessary to bring everyone home safely. Right up until the moment when she became Valkyrie again, one last time, and wrote a final chapter in a legend that would be told as long as pilots flew and stories were shared and call signs were whispered with reverence in ready rooms around the world. That was the day 283 people learned that sometimes the most extraordinary people look completely ordinary until the moment they are needed. That was the day 2 F-22 pilots flew escort for their hero and called it the honor of their careers. That was the day Sarah Chen, who had been trying to figure out what came after being a legendary fighter pilot, discovered that being Valkyrie was not something she did but something she was, woven so deeply into her identity that it could never be retired or set aside or forgotten. And that was the day the world learned that legends never truly retire. They just take different seats, wear different clothes, read different books, and wait quietly for the moment when they are needed again. Because that is what legends do. They answer when called. They rise to impossible challenges. They save lives. They inspire generations. And they do it all while insisting they are just passengers, just ordinary people, just doing what anyone would do. But those who know better, those who flew beside them and trained under them and heard their call signs whispered in reverence, they know the truth. They know that there is nothing ordinary about Valkyrie. There never was. There never will be. And on that November day over Denver, when both pilots collapsed and an aircraft full of terrified passengers faced certain death, the woman in seat 14A proved it one final time.